Welcome to Odden. Odden is a small town glued together by the core values of faith, family, and football. This once exclusively Baptist community rallies around its school football team as a source of community each weekend. Like many rural farming communities, Odden is in the midst of a demographic change stimulated by employment opportunities that have attracted families of divergent belief and color. Odden, like many small homogeneous communities, does not suffer change well. Rather than tolerance and acceptance, divisiveness, resentment, and spite grew and became overtly directed at the new members of Odden's community. Concerns over families who spoke other languages, who built new Catholic churches, did not sit well with the powerful white majority that continued to hold on to its traditional American values that also just happened to be racist and discriminatory. Through 2 years of continued community transition and growing discriminatory behavior in its high school, one climactic event became the school leadership's tipping point. Roberto Chavez, known to be tolerant of derogatory comments made toward him, was beaten by several white boys. As a result of both Roberto's incident and failed attempts to increase diversity of its high school teaching staff, the district leadership decides on the bold move of hiring an African American principal for its high school, and the move is supported by not only members of the board, but also by some of the more powerful and conscientious members of the community. Mr. Marshall is a principal of some 3 years who has just demonstrated improved achievement results in what had been a struggling urban high school. The leadership believes he is their leader to transform and unify Odden. Longtime English teacher Mr. Doyle, acting as the mouthpiece for the high school teaching staff, declares that student tardiness to class is an indication of the unprecedented decline in student obedience. Mr. Marshall enters this issue into 2 meetings with staff, but after failing to arrive at consensus or solution, he resolves to solve this issue on his own. Mr. Marshall designs high-stakes consequences that are punitive to demonstrate that this is a serious issue and that students need to change their behavior. The facts of the tardiness issue are that, on average, 60 of Odden's 200 students average 1 tardy to class per week, and that only 6 of the 60 students who are guilty of being tardy are students of color. Mr. Askins is the town Baptist deacon, one of the town's richest farmers and a former school board member. He is the quintessential power player, and unfortunately for Mr. Marshall and for all of Odden citizens, he's a bigot. Mr. Askins' answer to get rid of all forms of change and insist upon any new members of the community to adapt to the community's long-held ideals. The school shouldn't accommodate any second language services for its new students, and teaching with any multicultural sensitivity to Mr. Askins fell short of teaching these children how to be responsible American citizens. Despite students of color only being responsible for 10% of the tardiness issue, Mr. Atkins attributes all of the problem to the town's newcomers, inclusive of Mr. Marshall, whose failure to establish discipline and work ethic should be, to Mr. Askins' beliefs, cause for Mr. Marshall's dismissal, which he has openly discussed with the superintendent. Carla Askins just happens to be the daughter of our resident bigot, Mr. Askins. As you might guess, Carla doesn't think all the rules apply to her, and after receiving 2 after-school detentions for being tardy to class, she decides it's high time for her to give Mr. Marshall a piece of her mind. Meanwhile, her boyfriend, Clay Dobbs, who also happens to be the star of the football team, is upstairs getting his detention for showing up late to class, and when he realizes that this tardy will mean he won't be allowed to play in the big football playoff game this coming weekend, he has to be forcibly restrained from going after his teacher. Just as Carla Askins is leaving Mr. Marshall's office, who else but dear old Dad shows up to have a talk with Mr. Marshall. Mr. Askins was going to talk with Mr. Marshall about his mistakes, but when he learns the reason why his daughter is in trouble and that the school's star football player will miss his next game, Mr. Askins loses his cool in Mr. Marshall's office and yells that he should be fired while blaming all the school's problems on the new students of color. Caught up in the moment, Mr. Marshall yells back that it's the white kids who are 90% of the problem, and he directs Mr. Askins to leave. And then he slumps down in his chair, realizing that his outer office is filling with angry parents ready to have their say. Odden finds itself in the midst of a 3-part intersection of race in the form of white privilege, in the transformation of a small town into more of a melting pot, and in growing ethnic and racial and cultural diversity. The politics of Odden begin to brew over as a result of this white privilege, the affluence of its historical leadership, the control by a powerful majority, and it is now suffering from common insider meets outsider dynamics. Any thoughtful solution to Odden's problems will require intelligent system leadership that builds coalitions, develops shared decision-making, distributes leadership to staff inclusive of district leadership, to parents, to students, and to influential community members, with the purpose of developing stakeholder voice, power, and shared control that comes through empowering all with ownership of a shared solution. How then would a wizened sage EDL alumnus manage this embattled situation? They would take lessons from their learning, of course. They would understand how moral courage directs their actions. They would create a shared understanding of culture and meaning and purpose while exposing values that are dissonant with this new collective vision. They would also create a safe space for those traditional values that can blend with those new values to create synthesis and pride in the merger of new with old. From the sage teacher of leadership Warren Bennis, they would understand how to measure the volatility of just how far the organization needs to travel based upon how far apart the distance is between those old and new values. And as Gloria Steinem stated, the wise sage EDL leader would realize that there is no position to lead from when doing it on his own. And instead, they would inspire coalitions. As Jen Shirkani informs us, any great leader must always be aware of their fatal flaws, their blind spots, their ego traps. The wise leader would recognize that Mr. Marshall made a few mistakes along his path. He ignored signs of discord. He took control rather than engendering the sharing of it. He became blind to the impact that his punitive consequences were creating. He lost touch with the proportionality of the problem of tardiness, and he relapsed back to being Superman, that solo, isolated, independent leader of change, rather than realizing the enormity of discord that only consensus and partnership could solve. Saving the best for last, the wise sage EDL alum would tap into their U to recognize that while Mr. Marshall's conscience was on the right side of the U, his tactics were not. The wise leader would never order capitulation, especially in such an enormously charged issue that involved change in the form of race and ethnicity. Rather, the leader would become generative